And I wanted to go work at an early stage startup to learn and see what that was actually like. Because I figured, hey, I'm going to make all the mistakes. I'd rather learn on someone else's dime and make those mistakes somewhere else first.
You're listening to the Real Estate Sessions, and I'm your host, Bill Risser. With nearly 25 years in the real estate business, I love to interview industry leaders, up-and-comers, and really anyone with a story to tell. It's the stories that led my guests to a career in the real estate world that drives me in my 10th year and over 400 episodes of the podcast. And now, I hope you enjoy the next journey. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 416 of the Real Estate Sessions podcast. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for telling a friend. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about a cool new technology. A shout out to Marcy James for another wonderful guest suggestion. Marcy, please keep them coming. We are going to chat with A.K. Lalani, who is the founder of Rollout, which solves the issues of API. And trust me, there are lots of issues at times with API. So we're going to talk about that. But of course, we're also going to talk to AK about where he grew up and where his entrepreneurial spirit came from and all kinds of other good things. It's a fascinating story. It's going to be a lot of fun. So let's get this thing started. AK, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited to chat with you. I had a nice conversation with Marcy in Dallas at what was she there for? Might have
The 1,000-watt summit.
Oh, there you go. Were you there for that?
No, but I remember she mentioned she's going for that.
Yeah, so we had a nice conversation, and I'm really excited to kind of get to find out about your background like I do with all my guests. But I have a layman's knowledge of API, and I know it was always a hassle. And if you've created a solution to that hassle, like that's amazing. So, well, we're going to talk a lot about that. First question I ask every guest is, where'd you grow up?
So I grew up in Tanzania, which is on the coast of East Africa. But yeah, I was born in Kenya and moved to Tanzania as a 4 and grew up there all the way up until I came out to the U.S. for college.
Wow. So my first thought is maybe mom or dad had worked there. Is that kind of why you were there?
Yeah. So my parents both grew up in Pakistan, and they, had to provide for the family. And so my dad basically worked his way up at a bank, and, the bank said, hey, we're going to start a branch out in Kenya, and who wants to go? And no one raised their hands. And so he then basically said, well, if you give me a salary bump, I'll go. And they agreed to that. And so that's how we ended up in Kenya.
Wow.
And lived there for many years, and finally got an opportunity to go for another work opportunity when I was 4 years old to Tanzania. And so that's how we moved.
Can you explain to me what it's like being, entering school, let's say, right? Whatever, kindergarten or whatever it is in Tanzania.
Yeah.
First of all, did you speak the language? Did you learn it because you were there at that young age?
Yeah. So the entire country speaks Swahili, right? English is not something that most people speak. And so you had to learn the language. My parents did fortunately send me to an English-speaking school. So I was very fortunate in the sense that, it was somewhat of an international school. And so I did get a chance to, obviously speak in English and get more of a traditional education from that perspective. But yes, going to, kindergarten and all the way up through to high school in a developing country was very different from what a lot of my friends have experienced in the U.S.
What do you think it did for you? It seems to me like there's some big value about, I don't want to call it a hardship. I just want to call it's different, right? And so what are some of the things you take away from that going, I'm really glad that I had this experience?
I think the thing that jumps out is we were in the middle of just so many different things happening around us. And so, we grew up in this huge context of there's so much poverty around us, right?
Right.
And we got to, it was unfortunately very heartbreaking. And so you develop a sense of empathy. At the same time, because there was a lot of hardship in a developing country, right? There is this incredible sense of community, and there's this incredible sense of, hey, we're, here to help each other. And that is something I think was very impactful to myself as I grew up and kind of take away from that time in my life.
I'm going to take you a little bit further than that. It was more than impactful. Can you share the what you did there to help with that problem in Tanzania, right? Of poverty or some of the other issues as well. You actually started I don't want to call it a company, but an operation, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's really just a high school club.
Okay.
It's not,
All right.
we don't have to glamorize it, but part of that is, look, we grew up in, it was just incredible just to see all the resilient people around me. And so, when I say resilient people around me, like, because it was a developing country, we would have, drivers to effectively, drive us around. We would have maids in the house. It's pretty common there. But these people become a part of your life. So I've visited, our driver's house. I've met his wife, his children, and you get to see, how they live and some of the hardships that they've had to endure. And so for me, a big part of that was I became very motivated to help in any way I could. And so, when I was in high school, we started this thing called Prompt. It was a poverty reduction organization, and we really, spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do we actually have an impact on the people around us, right? And it's funny because in hindsight, a lot of the ideas were just from like forward thinking, development economists, right? We literally, maybe not a common thing that for most people to do in high school, but I spent a lot of time just reading like these popular books, like The End of Poverty by Jeffrey Sachs and a few others. They had a lot of really good ideas in there around healthcare and providing access to, rural producing assets. And so we would do things like buy hold these big fundraisers, these charity walks, and raise as much money as we could, in the tens of thousands of dollars almost, right? And then go and buy a bunch of mosquito nets and find populations that would suffer from malaria, and where we could basically go and prevent that, we would basically go distribute these, household by household, these rural villages. Or, one of the fun projects we did is we actually built an energy briquette press, and we would distribute that to schools in the area so they could produce their own energy. And being a developing country, there's price of oil goes up and down, fluctuates, it really impacts their budget. And this is a way for them to have a little more resiliency and being able to provide high quality education without being affected by the ups and downs of the energy markets.
I don't think we're glamorizing anything. I think that's really impressive. I'm trying to imagine most high school kids here. What are they thinking about, and what are they doing? And it's not that. So that's awesome. I'm going to assume though the early it was probably much earlier than your time with Prompt, where you were thinking about technology and entrepreneurship. It sounds like that was baked into you pretty early.
Less technology, but
Mhm.
yes, entrepreneurship for sure.
Yeah.
I'd say entrepreneurship was actually somewhat of an expectation versus like a dream. Uh, and part of that was, when my dad moved to Tanzania, it was for work opportunities so that he could actually have equity in the job that he
Mm.
was doing and become a partner in, this new venture. And that kind of started his journey of entrepreneurship. And so the expectation was always like, hey, he's going to build up, some sort of like family nest egg. And my job is being the only boy in the family to come and work for him and then eventually take over whenever he's ready to retire. Ironically, I have two sisters who both did join the family business and I never did. So go figure.
No, you did something different. You attend Stanford. I don't have a lot of guests on the show that have attended Stanford that are working in the real estate space. So my first question is this: that had to be a pretty important milestone in your life at the time, I would imagine, getting that. And do you remember getting the acceptance letter or email or whatever it was? That had to be pretty exciting.
Yeah, I absolutely do. So I remember it like it was yesterday. It was like a Sunday morning. I was flipping through my email. Email is much faster than snail mail, obviously,
Yeah.
given where I was. But, at this point, I had been rejected by a lot of colleges. And so, hadn't gotten into Harvard or Yale or any of the other ones. And so I was expecting to, get rejected as well. And I remember reading the email, came through and read it like 3, 4 times before I realized, hey, actually, no, this is not a rejection email. I actually got in. And my mom happened to be just in the next room. So I, go and tell her, so excited. I give her a hug. She hugs me back, super elated. She's like, congrats. What's Stanford? Is that a good school? Just because,
Yeah.
this is the time before a lot of social media. The internet wasn't as pervasive in our lives. They just hadn't heard of it. It
Yeah.
wasn't as big of a thing where we lived. And so, yeah, I think everyone was pretty happy afterwards, though, once we figured out what was going on.
Yeah. Tell me about time at Palo Alto. Had to just be an amazing part of your life.
Yeah. It was transformational in many ways. And, I think one of the things I didn't realize, I didn't fully understand the history of Silicon Valley and the
Mm.
context of living there and being part of it. And so I feel very grateful that I just kind of randomly ended up there. But yeah, I think going to Stanford was transformative in several ways. One is, I went from being maybe one of the smartest kids in my high school to being very mediocre and very average in the college context, and having to learn that I need to outwork everyone around me if I want to do well. And the second thing maybe I learned is I have to work on the right things because,
Mm.
I actually moved to, I went to college thinking I was going to be a civil engineer because I wanted to build low cost housing. And I thought that was going to be kind of the arc of my career, and realized, wow, there are so many people that are better at engineering than I am.
Wow.
And that forced me to just, figure out, hey, what am I good at? And turned out to be, economics. And, you know, that ended up being the focus of kind of my studies and whatnot. So that was, another great thing. But apart from that, just being in the middle of Silicon Valley, getting access to speakers, and not just that, like also seeing their arcs was a great way to learn firsthand
Mm.
what, firstly, like what the reality is on the ground versus what the media tells you. So, for example, Mark Zuckerberg gave a talk, like the last talk for like an intro to CS class that I was taking once. And I remember it pretty vividly because, he walks into the classroom, he walks into the classroom, it's fully packed because everyone's expecting this big guest speaker.
Yeah.
And he, literally, like I see him walk in next to me, like just walks past me, and, trying to like figure out, hey, where should I go? How do I get, and, someone taps him on the shoulder that they're expecting me up there. And he gives his entire talk that is very unpolished, very raw, very uncut. Is completely irrelevant for the entire classroom. He's talking about these like crazy technical scaling, like technologies he's working on. And the entire classroom is like, dude, this is an intro to CS class. We don't know what you're talking about. Compared to the guy you see today in the media, right? He is very polished, and he's got a point of view, and knows who his audience is. And so it's things like that are just very interesting to see as you get to know people before, or at least get to learn from people before they're rich and famous and very successful, and see what made the traits that they had that got them there, right? And like that we had a lot of very like successful people that I went to school with, that it was fun to actually see their arc as maybe like dumb college kids to people that are like on magazines now.
Yeah, the stories you don't share, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
all. That's
yeah,
what's done at Stanford stays at Stanford. I guess I'm just
yeah.
thinking. So you get your bachelor's there, you get your master's as well, and is it behavioral economics? Is that what do I have that right?
Yeah, that was concentration I kind of carved out for
Oh, okay,
myself as an area of interest.
okay.
My master's was in what's called management science and engineering,
Oh, okay,
but it was very focused on computer science as well.
okay, gotcha. So what is your plan now? Because you're not going to be working on, you're not an engineer building small, low cost homes. But what are you
Yeah,
doing?
yeah. So I had in the back of my mind that I wanted to be involved in technology entrepreneurship at some point,
Okay.
right? And I was basically ready to, explore that as a future career at some point, but I knew I wasn't ready at that point, right as I'd graduated. And I wanted to go work at an early stage startup to learn and see what that was actually like. Because I figured, hey, I'm going to make all the mistakes. I'd rather learn on someone else's dime and make those mistakes somewhere else first. My goal was really to find any startup that would hire me. And it was complicated because I was on a student visa. And so I would need someone to basically give me, like a sponsored visa,
Mhm.
right? And I literally found one company that was, these two Stanford MBAs that were starting a company in the solar space that were also international and happened to need to like get a lawyer to sponsor their own visas. And they were like, well, we don't mind, doing a third one because we were paying the lawyers already, but you'd have to come work with us. And that ended up being a startup called Aurora Solar, which is actually proptech adjacent in some ways, right?
Sure.
They're a solar software company.
And so you're with them for how long?
For about 5 years. So we
And did you
started
learn?
when,
Did you learn some mistakes along the way? I don't want to give
yeah,
anything away, but
yeah, absolutely. I mean,
okay.
so when I started, we didn't have a product, right? Hadn't written a line of code. And look, we got to build the product from scratch. We got to, you know, fumble our way around to getting early customers and then finally building an engine to grow from there. And, you know, we also were, when we started, Aurora Solar was not the first company in their space. They were actually starting behind, right? They were trying
Mm.
to catch up to other companies in the space. And so we learned how to compete in the marketplace and build better products faster than others and add real value to customers. And so, a lot of important takeaways, I'd say, from that experience.
You move on to a company called eGranary, which feels
Yeah.
like when I looked at this a little bit, like you're kind of revisiting a little bit of your previous
Yeah.
life. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. eGranary was basically me starting the journey of saying, hey, I think I'm ready to finally start something. So, I'd spent 5 years at Aurora. We built a real business. And, I thought I was ready to go onto an actual business of my own. And eGranary was partly something that I was just very inspired to do because we were working with a nonprofit, which is called the East African Farmers Federation, who serve millions of, impoverished farmers in, 7+ countries across East Africa. And the goal was to help them, obviously do things, basically give them access to capital and resources that help them, come out of poverty. We had a slide deck that showed you, hey, this is actually a good business while we do that.
Okay.
And so that was the thing that I was really inspired to go do. And so we spent, a year or so building this platform out. We onboarded about 200,000 farmers, which is kind of a crazy feat given, no one had smartphones. This is literally off of SMS
Wow.
and dispersed, loans kind of in the millions of dollars to them that we had a pretty good repayment rate on. And, the company continues to exist and has done extremely well. I had actually just gotten married at that point. And so, about the 1 year mark, it was really a go time decision of, hey, I got, this business is starting to work. Am I going to move my family, my wife, myself to East Africa to kind of like go do this thing? And turned out that that just wasn't the right fit for our family at the time. But it was one of the most fun things we've ever done.
Wow. Austin was a better fit. Is that what I'm getting here?
It did end up working out a little bit better. Yeah.
Okay. Just checking because that's where you're based out of now, correct?
I'm actually in Houston right now.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. So, did you start in Austin when you made your Texas journey?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Good.
So, you know, part of it was also like, all right, well, where do we want to live next? And Austin was a really great place to be. Part of it was I'd just been in Palo Alto for 10 years and
Mm.
wanted to try something new. And Austin was this like, interesting, artsy, but also had some sort of tech presence and just seemed like a fun, relaxed environment to kind of go to.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we ended up there for a few years before moving to Houston, kind of when we want to be closer to family as we had children and whatnot.
Nice. Good. You're the founder of Rollout, and it's like many startup names. Sometimes it doesn't tell you what it does, but it does when you know, if that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah. I like to, as a layman, just kind of say this is simplifying all the issues that people have with API, especially in prop tech, because it's all about the data for just about every prop tech company. Am I good there? I'll let you
Yeah,
expand on that.
no, absolutely. That's correct, right? I think the problems most prop tech companies run into with respect to integrations is, they build this amazing product, they're trying to solve a real problem for agents, brokerages, teams. And, let's just say they're doing something along the lines of nurturing leads or helping you convert existing leads or just generating more leads, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And, they, as in the process of selling to anywhere from individual agents all the way to, brokerages and franchises, they're going to get asked like, hey, can you connect to my existing CRM? Can you connect to the tools that I already use, the source of truth? And, they'll say, yes, let me go build that. And, most people will start with a follow-up boss integration and they'll build it and they'll realize, wow, this is a lot of work and it's really hard. And okay, now everyone's asking me for, a Real Geeks or a Sync or, another
Yeah.
CRM integration. And then they have to kind of like solve for several different things that we try to take off the plate, right? So like the first thing is just firstly budgeting the resources, right?
Okay.
Building an integration will take you weeks to months. And I've literally heard from folks, there's a few that have taken them years to build, right?
Mm.
Then there's the maintenance of it as well. So it's not just a one-time build, but as you get more usage, you'll realize, hey, we have to do all sorts of things for all these edge cases that we hadn't seen. Like, oh, this one has it set up as a multi-office versus a single person. This company has all these configurations and custom fields that we have to accommodate, et cetera, et cetera. And so, there's like that budgeting of actual developer resources and engineering resources on there, that they have to like do. The second is, hey, every API is different. And so you have to standardize the data. And, what is called leads in one system might be called people in another. Features that exist in one system may not exist in others. And, sometimes you basically, literally have to learn the nuances of every single system. So how do pawns work in a Railgeeks versus how do they work in another system, right? There's all sorts of like nuances there that you have to educate yourself on to be able to like create an integration that works for your customers. And, the third part of that is sometimes the data isn't even available via API, right?
Okay.
So what, you might have this incredible robust integration with one system and you want to replicate that for another system and turns out, hey, the API doesn't actually even give you that data, even though the feature exists. And, trying to get someone else to, release like a new API is, pushing a boulder up a hill. It's,
Yeah.
it's very, very, very hard to do. And then I think lastly, once you have all this working, the APIs change all the time, right? Or, the restrictions and permissions around them change. And so, I think Vault Bus was just in the news saying, hey, we're going to take away these two APIs that we've offered for years, for example, right? And so that's where a company like Rollout comes in. And what we do is we say, hey, look, you build once and connect everywhere, and you're basically done, right? What we do on our side is we fill in the missing data pieces. So we get you all the data, we standardize it into one format, and we keep up with all the maintenance and all the changes, right? So you're never impacted by these. And we've done all the legwork and continue to do so. And we've pre-solved all these issues that, you would have run into if you were building it yourself, but we've pre-solved them for you. So it's just plug and play. So you kind of build once with us and you're integrated everywhere. We started with CRMs primarily. We've now added transaction management software and we just released our first loan origination software. And so, we're kind of adding a few more categories over time.
What what was the trigger for you to even start this company? I mean, what it obviously it sounds amazing. I had a brief fling with a startup out of Australia for a few years, and
Yeah.
it was a big deal trying to move data around, the right data at the right time. And so I completely feel for the people that have that struggle. But what you had to be, were you thinking about prop tech? Was there something that said, you know what, this is space and there's a ton of stuff going on there. And if you can solve a problem maybe that no one's really ever looked at before, I think that's massive. And maybe that's part of your journey.
Yeah, we started off building horizontally before we focused in on prop tech, right? And so we started off building a white labeled Zapier, right? And we, grew that to, let's say 100 plus customers. We were doing about 10 million API calls a day. And once we had built our first 100 plus integrations, every single customer would now ask us, hey, don't build, something more generic like a Gmail or a Slack or a Salesforce, but they wanted their industry specific integrations.
Hmm.
And what we had realized is we can't do that for every single industry. That's just too many. There's too much context that we'd have to learn. And so we started looking at, hey, where do we have the most customers? And it happened to be real estate.
Hmm.
A lot of real estate companies already use Zapier. And so I think that's why
Mm-hmm.
our product was very appealing. We had a lot of customers in that space. And we basically said, all right, this is interesting. Let's dig in a little bit deeper. And as we kind of started to go deeper in there, we realized, wow, there are such large problems, and the sources of truth for a lot of brokerages, those are not connected to all the other systems that they want to use. And there's a lot of opportunity if we are able to solve that in a way that makes the lives of the prop tech founders and companies much easier, right? And so we started going down that journey and had, this product pulled out of us, really.
MLS data is a big piece of the puzzle. Are you able
Yeah.
to work in that space as well? I mean, obviously, if it's brokerage, they have the right, they have access to that sort of data. But then when it's another sort of a company that has to then acquire the data with permissions and things, do you play in all that stuff too?
Yeah, it's funny. You could basically think of what we currently do as like an analog for what some folks like the Constellation Ones or the Atoms have kind of done for MLS data, where they give you a single API to connect to all the different MLS feeds,
Right.
right? We don't do that, and really part of that is just because it feels like it's a solved problem. We would just be another vendor in a space where many exist already.
Gotcha.
Our goal has really just been to solve unique problems that just haven't been solved yet,
Wow.
and just do them better than anyone else.
What's your most common integration? Is it CRM? Because that's where you started, or?
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of products that help with the leads, kind of like everywhere between like generating, nurturing, converting, scoring, everything kind of to do with leads, right? And so
Yeah.
CRM has been a very, very common use case for us.
You mentioned loan origination. They feels to me like they were like we really early in the game when it came to kind of moving information around. The loan the LOSs were always there back in when I first started in the industry in 2000. They were doing some
Yeah.
stuff already. So does that make it easier or more complex for you as you try to roll out that industry?
Yeah, loan origination is a super interesting space.
Yeah.
There's one large player who dominates, right? And I want to say they have 50% market share, and then everyone else is, 10% or less, right? And so it's like, if you kind of get one of them, you hit most of the 80-20, and then everything else is pretty fragmented. But the issue is the large player in the space, right? If you were to go to them and say, hey, I want to integrate with you, they'll basically tell you to give them about 15% of your revenues, if not more, right? And like, the numbers that you'll get quoted
Yeah.
to even build integration is actually insane. And so part of the innovation that we've had to come up with is like, hey, how can we enable an integration here without, any one of our customers having to fork over basically like all their runway in order to be able to integrate, right? How can they grow their business without doing that? And so we've had to kind of like do a bunch of innovative things around that front.
Wow. What's on the horizon for Rollout? I mean, I know you're always forward thinking. Like you're probably 3-4 steps down the road, but what can you talk about? I'll say, on a podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to share that we just released our MCP server, right? And so anyone that's building an AI, which a lot of folks are right now,
Mm-hmm.
MCP is kind of the protocol that everyone is using to communicate with APIs and do very interesting and innovative things, right? And so I'll give you an example. Just yesterday, I was playing with our little, our internal demo, and I connected to my CRM. And I asked it, okay, well, firstly, like, give me a list of leads. Tell me more about this one specific lead. And for that one specific lead, it not only pulls in the basic information, but it pulls in all the notes, all the tasks, all the email communication we've had. So it gives me the full context. And then I'm able to ask it complex things like, hey, who is my best lead source in the last month? And it will, because it's connected to an AI engine that has the ability to process logic, it's able to create a table of, hey, these are all the different like lead sources you've had here are all the different categorizations, and this is the one that is best. And then I can ask it to do even more, like more complex things like create a node, do this task, right? I can actually ask it to fulfill or do things that I would do, right? And so if you're an agent out there, imagine kind of having this voice enabled, right? And on the road, you could basically just tell it to do all the things versus having to manually update your CRM at the end of the day, right? While you're on the road. And I think there's just a lot of very interesting possibilities here. And so we're starting to pilot this with some early customers. I imagine this will be commonplace a few years from now, if not a year from now. But we're the first people to enable this, and I'm really excited to see what people end up doing with it.
Wow. Yeah, you think about it. The fact that you could talk to AI was a big deal, but it's like warp speed for all this stuff, right? It's incredible how fast we're moving down a path. There's, I don't know if you know a guy named Jason Pantana, right? Who's works with Tom Ferry, and his focus for the last few years has just been AI. And to watch his YouTube channel and just see, you're kidding me, we're doing that now already, and because I thought that was just a few years down the road. But that's really cool. Yeah, the ability to and you could iterate on those prompts, right? You could just continue to narrow down to be exactly what you needed for that upcoming meeting or whatever it is, right?
100%.
That's awesome.
100%.
That's super cool. All right. Well, okay. Look, I've had you here the time I asked you for, but I have to ask you the same final question I've asked every guest. This is it. And I know you're not a realtor, never have been a realtor, but you know them well now. You're working with them and all that good stuff. What one piece of advice would you share with a new agent just getting started?
Yeah. So I've been a home buyer, and I can tell you from my experience from that perspective, so one of our customers is this guy called Mark Choey, who is he's an industry veteran from having started Climb and, most recently High Note.
Yeah.
He had this amazing strategy when he was starting Climb, which was he dominated this one building, right? And he literally bought a house there and then sold all the units in the building. And that would be kind of my advice, which is just create your local monopoly, right? Because I bought a house in a neighborhood that's literally like 2 square miles large.
Yeah.
And we ended up hiring the realtor that literally had the monopoly on this market because she knew everything about it. She was the local expert. She could get a transaction done faster and better than anyone else. And that's the advice I'd give anyone, which is like find a small area where you think there's an opportunity and then be the person, be the realtor for that area.
That's a fantastic answer. I'll tell you, I've been doing this since Jay Thompson was the first guest. And so you're episode 416 and no one's ever said that yet. So congratulations. Wow. I feel like I should be sending you a prize because it's hard. Mostly, I've been a lot of mentors, find someone to help me, which makes perfect sense. That's a great thing too. But I love that. And Mark Choi's amazing. Yeah. So he's been on the show before when he started High Note. I think High Note's amazing with what he does. So that's very cool. AK, if somebody wants to reach out to you, is there an easy way for them to do that?
Yeah, just ak@rollout.com. Send me an email or feel free to add me on LinkedIn. Happy to chat there too.
Awesome. This has been great. Once again, Marcy comes through. She's amazing. And it's been really fun to watch what you've done so far. And I can't wait to see especially how that MCP and AI stuff's going to work together. That's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
No, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. It's been a long journey for you as well. And so happy to kind of be part of that for you.